First of all, a warm welcome for me. I'm Rosie. I'm the Chair of Trustees at the Mint House. For friends who have not joined us before, we're a restorative practice centre based in Oxford, set up as our name suggests, really, to increase understanding and use of restorative justice and practice. One of the ways we try and do that is to host events that relate restorative justice and practice to what you might describe as the pressing issues of our times. And I think there can be few more pressing issues of our times than finding ways of making our asylum system more just and humane. So I was excited to learn that Steve Kirkwood from Edinburgh University had been researching that issue, and which I know hasn't been much researched before. And we're really glad and grateful that Steve has agreed to share the findings of that research with us today. So looking forward to very much to what Steve's got to share. We'll move to hearing from him very soon. Just a bit of, if you like, pre-publicity, though not yet formally advertised, but forthcoming events on the 24th of April, when David Moore and Iliki Burnham will be talking about a new book they've written called Setting Relations Right. And then it's back to Scotland on the 9th of May, when Ashley Scotland from Thriving Survivors and Joanna Chaplin will be talking about what we can learn from Scotland about what how to embed restorative justice. So those are 2 dates for the diary about which publicity will be coming around soon. You'll have seen that the event's being recorded, so if you don't want your face to show, please keep your camera off, but we hope that's all okay. And at the end of the session, Hannah will put up an evaluation link, and as always, it'd be great to get your feedback. But enough from me. I'd like to hand over to Steve now, and for his presentation, which will be followed by the usual questions and conversation. So thank you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Rosie, and thanks so much for the invitation to speak to all the participants today. It's a real privilege, and it's great, as you say, to be able to connect, this research, which is on, I think, a really pressing issue for us all. I'm just going to bring up my slides just a minute. Okay. Wonderful. So thanks again. I'm Steve Kirkwood. I'm a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Edinburgh. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a project that I undertook last year, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, called Forced Migration and Moral Repair. And in particular, what I'm going to be talking about today is restorative justice in relation to the asylum system. So globally, there are more than 100 million people who are considered by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to be people of concern, essentially people who are displaced in one way or another. The majority are actually displaced in their countries of origin. Many other are forced to flee to neighboring countries, and some manage to make it to other countries to seek asylum. But the experience of forced migration itself creates a whole range of harms and injustices. People are affected, obviously, by war and conflict, persecution that exists and takes place in their countries of origin. The experience of trying to seek asylum it can be also extremely dangerous and traumatic, so that people can suffer great harms in transit, essentially, or trying to reach places of safety. And actually, these harms and injustices, when people reach, let's say, a place of safety, tend actually to be completely overlooked. So like in the United Kingdom, actually the harms that people have experienced and those injustices, that there's very little done to actually try and address those themselves. Looking at the impact of the asylum system, let's say in the United Kingdom, what we see is that actually these systems and processes, while they ought to really help support people in a process of recovery, they tend to actually create various harms and traumas themselves, and often compound people's trauma. One of the ways that this occurs is through border securitization. So even though countries such as the United Kingdom sign up to the Geneva Convention for the Protection of Refugees, in practice, what they do is actually secure borders and try and externalize these processes to prevent people actually entering the country to avail themselves of the legal rights of gaining asylum. And this has a whole range of consequences, including, as we know, for example, the many deaths in the Mediterranean, or indeed deaths for people who are trying to cross the British Channel. One of the effects as well that many people experience is destitution, and so that people who are attempting to apply for asylum, and some of those who have their asylum claims rejected, can find themselves destitute. And indeed, actually, some people have even who receive a positive outcome on their asylum claim can also find themselves in states of destitution. And what many have commented is that actually destitution is used as a kind of a policy tool to try and dissuade people from applying and seeking asylum, and to try and push people out of the country. Many people also experience detention, usually intended to then result in them being removed from the country. But this can be experienced as being relatively arbitrary. Sometimes people are detained and then released and then detained, and it's not always clear to them why this is happening. And also there are huge amounts of uncertainty that's created by this as well, because unlike, for example, when someone is imprisoned and they are sentenced to a certain period of time, in detention, there's a greater level of uncertainty as to when you might actually be released. And overall, the asylum system creates high levels of uncertainty, even though the Home Office claims that asylum claims are dealt with swiftly. In practice, that's simply not the case. And some people may spend many years waiting for an outcome on their asylum claim, or if they're going through the appeals process, getting a final determination. And this has significant impacts on them and family members and so on. Racism can be a significant problem for people in the asylum system, and we see this really at the highest levels when we have hostile rhetoric coming from senior politicians, let's say, that essentially actually embed racist policies and practices within the asylum system itself. And then we can also see this can happen in local neighborhoods as well. And that's not to say, of course, that the response to refugees and asylum seekers is always unwelcoming, because that's far from the truth, where you have many occasions when people are actually very supportive and connect with colleagues and welcome them as well. But the sad reality is that many people do experience racism, discrimination. As we've seen in recent months, the UK is trying to bring in offshore processing to try and force people specifically to go to Rwanda to have their asylum claims processed. And this is used in some other places internationally, Australia being a kind of case in point. And we can see that this is part of the move to try and push people away and prevent people from claiming asylum, but also really risks all sorts of further harms for those people themselves. To give a sense of the experience of the asylum system itself, here's a quote from one of the people that I spoke to as part of the project, who is of a refugee background. He said, "I've been in the asylum process. It hammers you completely, shatters your confidence totally, because you're never sure. There's no certainty in life, and you're not allowed to work. You're not allowed to better yourself. When you turn on the news every day and there's something about stop the boats, if you're not a person that's come on a boat, you feel a part of it. So that wears you down. It really, really does. It harms. It harms in a very, very big way. So to get that confidence back to being this human being, that I am worthy, it's really quite hard." So you can see just in this experience itself, how the rhetoric tied to specific policies and practices impacts on people quite directly, including wearing down their sense of actually their own humanity and their own worth. So how I kind of came to this project is that over many years I've been involved in research on restorative justice and research on refugees and asylum seekers, having looked at the integration of asylum seekers and refugees in Scotland and UK political discourse. But I've basically done these as kind of separate research programs. But the more I've kind of worked on these topics, I could see that there was potential to try and bring them together. There's very little that's really been done in this space. space. And so I thought it would be worth trying to ask, what could restorative justice offer for addressing the harms created by the asylum system? And I'm talking about the asylum system in particular, because the more I kind of did work in this area, I could see that actually that was one of the major concerns, not necessarily actually the harms and injustices that people might have experienced in their country of origin, although that was obviously important, but actually the way that the asylum system, say in the UK, actually compounds those harms and creates new ones. The project itself is relatively small scale and quite exploratory, mainly because actually there's so little that's been done in this area before. So I undertook a literature review looking at restorative justice with refugees and migrants, of which there's a small body of research. Restorative justice in post-conflict settings. So this is things like truth and reconciliation commissions, which look to actually address the harms and re-establish forms of justice in those kind of post-conflict contexts. Here, refugees and asylum seekers are sometimes considered, but often even then they tend to get marginalized. And there's some work that's done around refugees and repatriation, so where people are returning to their country of origin, and the potential for restorative type practices to assist with those forms of integration. I undertook a small number of interviews. So this included 5 representatives from restorative justice providers in England, some of those providing quite large scale services across different parts of the country. And I also interviewed 2 restorative justice practitioners in Belgium, where they're using restorative justice practices in asylum reception centres. I interviewed representatives from 2 organisations in Scotland who are working on refugee justice issues, and someone who manages an asylum reception centre in Belgium. And I also interviewed 2 people of a refugee background, both of whom were based in Scotland. What I'm going to do in this presentation today is essentially take you through 3 examples of how restorative justice or restorative practices can be used, either is being used or has the potential to be used in relation to people within the kind of asylum process. The first is a grassroots refugee-led justice initiative in Scotland. The second is the use of restorative practices in Belgium asylum centres. And the third is looking at restorative justice services in England. So the first example is grassroots refugee-led justice initiative in Scotland. So to give the context, in lockdown 2020, what happened was asylum seekers were moved at very short notice into hotels. It wasn't always clear to them why that was happening. Some of them would be, many of them would be in their own flats, for example, and then were being required to move into hotels. It was claimed that this was for their own safety, but there's a lot of questions as to really the rationale and reasoning behind this. One of the effects was that it increased levels of stress and trauma, moving people out of their own homes into hotels at the short notice, and also creating levels of uncertainty and confusion. There was quite a loss of autonomy, even basic things. For example, in people's own homes, they had the ability to buy their own food and cook their own meals, but in the kind of the hotel context, they were being provided with food directly, for example, and that reduced their ability to make basic decisions about their lives. There was pretty limited access to resources, and so this included, for example, reducing or not providing the kind of the cash money that people had access to prior, because, for example, it was said that the food was, say, provided to them, so they didn't need the money that they might otherwise need for that. People were highly isolated, of course, in the context of lockdown. Many people experienced those feelings of isolation, but here these were kind of exacerbated by restricting, what people could actually do in that context. Many people talked about a lack of dignity. This included, for example, hotel staff coming into people's rooms without even knocking, for example. So the ability to have that kind of like private space was also gone, and there was relatively limited support. So, for example, access to counselling services was really limited, and in the hotels, staff weren't really trained in how to support refugees or asylum seekers and the kinds of levels of trauma that they may have experienced. So that was the context, and specifically something that happened that is referred to sometimes as the Park Inn tragedy was that an asylum seeker from Sudan stabbed 6 people and was shot and killed by police. The man was suffering a severe mental episode, and also it was discovered later that he'd made 72 calls to try and seek help in various ways, and he had even said to some people before the incident that he was intending to stab someone. So it was a significant tragedy that created a great deal of harm. Obviously, the people who were stabbed by him, he was shot and killed, but also the experience among other people there, among other asylum seekers in the hotel, among the staff, among emergency services personnel, and so on, who were present or more broadly affected by the events there. One of the things that came out of this was a group of asylum seekers and refugees decided to start an organization called Refugees for Justice. And it was really to try and find a way to respond to the harm and injustice that occurred, particularly around the Park Inn tragedy, but also more broadly, the kind of the policy and practices, specifically of moving people into hotels at short notice, and everything even more widely around how asylum seekers are treated in Scotland, to try and get some answers and to find some ways of actually addressing the harm. One of the things that they created was the Asylum Inquiry Scotland, which has attempted to look into these issues to try and understand what happened. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is that they had something called a listening day, where they brought people together to really be able to tell their stories to each other about what happened, to hear them, to have them validated, and to try and support each other. Here's one of the things that was said about that by a representative from a justice organization. There was even like a listening session. That was a full listening day, actually, where a lot of different people, asylum seekers, were invited. It was such a powerful space to be in, because for the first time, I think, they were telling that incident to each other. They didn't know, like, even if you were part of the same group, you never really share your experience of it. And like the details that came out through sharing, and it was a lot of tears were shed that day. But I think that was the process of healing that many people needed. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in, because we can see how this might resonate with, for example, restorative practices like healing circles, which are intended to allow people to share their experiences, to have them validated in a kind of a safe space. What a person of a refugee background said about the inquiry and the processes was this. Now, with this inquiry, it's like it ripped off the bandage again. It opens the wounds again, and you relive these things again. It's not something that you don't want to forget, but you don't want to remember it. Why would you want to remember injustice? But why would you not want to remember it? You can't forget it. When you forget it, it's like you're okay with what they did, that they did it with you and they got away with it, and that's not what I want. She said, I came with trauma and I was kind of fine until they doubled the trauma that I had. They need to give, they need to acknowledge, they need to compensate us. They need to restore our dignity, our losses. Restorative justice needs to happen. So here she's talking about this process of engaging in the inquiry and the listening day and so on. And it's interesting, I guess, to think about this idea that it's ripped off the bandage again. So you have these wounds, the trauma that's created by the tragedy itself, but then having to kind of face up to it, to go through this process of healing. So on the one hand, it's difficult, it's hard, and you don't want to do it, but on the other hand, you feel like you have to do it, and that you benefit from doing it and actually facing up to and trying to engage and work through and share the harms, but also trying to understand how you can find some way of repairing it. And so she talks about compensation, and she talks about restoring dignity, which I think tap into these ideas of restorative justice. I mean, reflecting on it more broadly, what we can see is the power of sharing and listening by taking this kind of approach and trying to seeking to restore dignity and respect. What people talked about was this idea of addressing harm and preventing future harm. In particular, when they talked about reparations were framed in terms of, for example, providing counselling support to help people address the harm and heal and recover from what happened, and to change policies and practices so that this type of scenario was not created again, the type of harm and trauma that happened. One of the real challenges was a lack of engagement from government and private housing providers. So obviously the Home Office is a key player in the way that the asylum system operates and, you know, drives the direction of policy here, and there was no engagement from them in this process. Also, private housing providers are paid to provide the housing to asylum seekers, and they also did not engage in this process. So you can see that there are some benefits around having these types of processes, that kind of sharing and listening and helping to address the harm in that way, but also some real challenges in terms of especially trying to get the state to take responsibility for causing harm. Okay, the second example I want to turn to now is the use of restorative practices in Belgium asylum centres. So Rundle, Shetty and Negria have undertaken some research in this area. And they talked in particular about the nature of trauma in relation to asylum seekers and refugees, and how this figures when thinking about a restorative justice approach. So they say trauma relates to an internal change within the neurological system of every individual who is exposed to abuse, neglect, or disrespect of the humanness of being. The restorative lens is one that recognizes our humanity and the need for sustaining relationships. If we are to be successful with the refugee population, we need to recognize their needs and respond appropriately. So they really front up the nature of trauma and how taking a restorative approach is actually one that sensitizes us to the nature of people's trauma and how we ought to respond in a way that helps recovery and recognizes how trauma may affect people. They talk about compassionate witnessing. So this might be the idea of having someone who can really listen to and validate and empathize with people's experiences. In terms of the practices, they talk about proactive circles. So here the idea is to nurture community, build relationships, establish expectations, and facilitate norms to support each other. So this is the kind of work where you're doing to actually support like constructive communication and ways of relating to each other. Also, you have responsive circles. So this is actually where some kind of conflict or harm has occurred. And so the idea that you use these types of processes to address that conflict or harm, to restore relationships and try and develop self-worth. So in the Belgium asylum centres, they've brought in these practices. And the background to this was that they recognised that some of the responses that they were using to difficulties in the centres tended to be punitive. So for example, if someone had been involved in harmful behaviour, then they might remove them from the centre, they might move them somewhere else, for example, or have some other kinds of sanctions, for example. And they found that there wasn't this constructive. What they ended up doing was training all staff in restorative practices. And one of the things that they highlighted was that it wasn't just actually the kind of frontline staff, but they would train the staff in restorative practices who were involved in any aspect of running the centre. So they might be involved in like the finance or the HR side or something like that. But they were also involved because they saw that it was important to have an understanding and practices running right through the centre. So they use restorative responses to conflict or harm. And one of the things that they also talked about was having restorative responses to timeouts and what they call disciplinary transfers. So for example, if someone had been involved in problematic behavior, then they might have a kind of a timeout where they came out of the centre for a period of time. But what they did during that time was aim to try and rebuild relationships and trust so that people could actually return to the centre and they could strengthen relationships. So one of the things that they did, for example, was to have these connection days. And so this is where a staff member from the centre would actually go and meet up. So this was the interviewee I was speaking to was talking about young people in particular here involved in the asylum system, and to spend like a significant amount of time with them in a way that kind of humanized relationships. One of the things they might do is actually go around a city, for example, and take photos and talk about it, to share things about, you know, their life, their interests and so on, just to kind of build better connections with people, and then to use this as a way to help essentially reintegrate or bring someone back in to that centre, as opposed to what they might have done before, which is just to move them somewhere else. They also use restorative practices to try and support people with negative asylum application outcomes as well. These people are in a very difficult situation where they may feel that they can't return to their countries of origin, but they essentially don't have any legal right to remain in the country. So engaging with them in a kind of empathic and constructive way is even more important. And overall, what they have reported is that there is a reduction in conflict from using these types of processes. So what they said, for example, and how this can create a restorative environment was by creating a place that youngsters can be who they are. And we also see that with refugees and trauma, it's a lot about control. And sometimes if we try to give the control back, that's also restorative practice for me, because you are in an equal relationship. So whereas, one response, if someone has experienced trauma, might be to try and protect them, if you like, and to remove kind of like decision making, here they're saying that actually bringing back control and empowerment and autonomy is actually one of the ways of helping people to deal with trauma and to recover, rather than actually limiting that. And they said the conflict itself, it's not a problem, but most of the time it's the way how we handle the conflict has more impact, and how we can invest in restoring things, and then we can do things together. So it wasn't the idea that there would no longer be any conflict. There would still be conflict, but you could actually respond to it in a constructive way. You could even think about it, I guess, in terms of the transformational potential of conflict, that when people come into conflict, then this shows that it might actually be better in different ways of doing things. And if you can respond in a constructive way through the use of, say, restorative practices, you might actually transform things into a better way than they were before the conflict. They talked a lot about the importance of connection. They said the less connection, the more delinquent behavior you have. But it's not only with the refugees who live there, it's also with the employees. It's the same story. It's for like every human being. And what we see is that the employees who work there, they have to work in like extremely challenging conditions because there's not a lot of budget. The infrastructure is like really poor. It's like the most challenging job I've ever seen. So one of the things is recognizing not only the asylum seekers and their needs and the difficulties they're encountering, but actually people working in such centers also are likely to find it quite a challenging and stressful environment, particularly if there's this kind of lack of resources. So a big part of this is helping the employees themselves to have restorative practices in order to engage better with themselves and to support themselves as well. They said that connection between people, between colleagues, between residents, between employees, that's for me the key. And everything else you build on that connection, but having that connection is the most important thing. So really, I think one of the key things here was that using those kinds of restorative practices, constructive communication, to build effective relationships with each other, on what grounds then you could continue to build. And it also meant that when there were problems, say in the centre, that you had a basis that allowed a more constructive response. Okay, some of the challenges that they encountered here, including needing to convince colleagues at all levels of the importance of the restorative approach. So, if you're going to change an organization or an institution, then ensuring that people are able to come on board is really important. There could be issues around language and cultural norms around communication. So obviously one of the issues can be that people don't speak the local language. And so this can be a challenge. And they also talked a little bit about communication kind of norms. Some examples being that actually in some cultures, it might be quite normative to discuss problems in a way that resembles restorative practices, where you actually get around and have dialogue and work constructively towards consensus. Some of the things they said included, for example, there might be norms where younger people don't talk up to older people. And so if you were actually trying to facilitate a conversation where you wanted this to be able to happen, that could be a challenge. So having to work with people to kind of give them the permission and support them and enable them to be able to take part in a dialogue might be something you'd have to consider. They also talked about how that people coming in and applying asylum in Belgium, it may be that they actually spend quite a long time before they get access to, say, an asylum centre, and may be homeless, for example, during that period of time, which could really exacerbate mental health problems. And then, so if they came into a reception centre after that period of time, Then, I mean, you have the mental health issues that may have been exacerbated, but also trust might be something that would have to be carefully built and rebuilt, because they may see you just as part of the same system, which really forced them into that situation. So how do you actually build relationships to overcome that? And one of the points as well is that they actually could make a lot of changes within the centres, and some of the things that they talked about actually were really quite simple. So part of it was about allowing people to, share things about what they wanted to happen in the centre, and some of that was just around how food might be prepared. It might be around how you might have pictures on the walls and so on, just to humanize the place. They didn't necessarily have to be that complicated, but they could do that. They could find constructive ways of dealing with conflict and so on, but that might leave the broader structural kind of context unchanged. It didn't really, change the asylum system as a whole, or those broader issues that people are facing, but they could at least make some progress within the centres themselves. Okay, the third example I want to talk about briefly here is about restorative justice services in England. And this is really looking at the potential for such services to engage with asylum seekers and refugees. So as I say, I interviewed representatives from a range of services. Overwhelmingly, the response was that they actually had never worked with asylum seekers or refugees to their knowledge. So what I was really doing here was trying to elicit, based on the experience that they have so far, what do they think are some of the potentials? So some of the things we talked about were, for example, if they had provided restorative justice to people of a migrant background, or people who had didn't have English as a first language, if they had used restorative justice in relation to racist hate crime, for example, and trying to build on these kinds of experiences to understand, well, what might be some of the potentials, what might be some of the challenges and barriers. So some of the benefits and opportunities that were identified as potential anyway from existing literature and from these interviews, some of which are basically what you would expect from restorative justice if provided to people of any background. The potential for restorative justice to increase mutual understanding, the potential to empower people, and particularly in actually dealing with harm and conflict that affects them. They talked about the potential for restorative justice to help in addressing racism because it enables the ability to allow people to connect at a human level, to try and empathize, to try and learn from each other. And also that restorative justice might have a role for asylum seekers and refugees in terms of supporting recovery and increasing belonging, because it can help enable a sense of connectiveness and welcoming. And might help them to deal with and overcome some of the issues they might be facing. And I think part of what one of the Belgian practitioners said earlier as well, that actually trying to bring back control might be part of trying to help people deal with the trauma they've experienced. Some of the challenges and barriers included language, so where people, for example, have a low level of English, and how that might create a challenge for engaging with people, and interpreting. And there were different views on interpreting, but mainly that interpreting could be done within restorative justice practices, but that it could create challenges in the kind of dynamics by introducing another person essentially in the process. Mistrust could be a challenge, particularly as asylum seekers and refugees may have experienced persecution, for example, from the police or the state in their countries of origin, but also by the way they may have been treated by official institutions in the United Kingdom, including the asylum system itself might have embedded feelings of mistrust, or indeed they might be worried about their immigration status. And so this is something that needs to be considered and overcome. Also the impact of trauma and whether people's basic needs are being met. So because of, for example, trauma they might have experienced in their countries of origin or in transit and so on, but also as in the example I gave of lockdown in Scotland, how trauma might have been compounded by issues that occurred actually in the country of asylum. And are people's basic needs being met? Are people actually destitute? Are they in a place to engage in restorative justice? Cultural difference was talked about, and there was kind of different views on this. One of the kind of overwhelming arguments from practitioners was that cultural difference wasn't really a barrier to restorative justice, because it came down to people's individual needs and wishes about whether they would want to take part in restorative justice, and that you get a whole range of different views even within a culture as to people whether people think restorative justice is a good idea or whether they wish to engage. as you might do between cultures. But there was some indication that there might be some kind of cultural norms, for example, and expectations, including people's experiences and expectations around criminal justice practices and processes and how they operate in their country of origin, what might be considered a crime. Some of that can vary across different jurisdictions, for example, and so those might be some things that need to be considered. Just to give you an idea of some of the things that the practitioners I spoke to raised. So they talked about the potential for restorative justice in relation to supporting recovery and belonging. And one practitioner said, to have already gone through the trauma that you have been through and finally get here, and then to be, if you were then caused harm by people, saying, go back to your country, or, getting harm from people here. I just think that, to then be able to realize that, there are people who will change their opinion once they know them and who understand them. It'll make them feel much more welcome, much less suspicious, and help their recovery process if, if it's not harm upon harm, but at least one layer of the harm is being addressed. So there's something around being able to send a message to people that actually the harm they experienced was being taken seriously and that people actually care about them. And even if they've experienced something such as racism, there are others who will support them in addressing that. And that hopefully by taking part in a restorative justice process, they might even have someone who has committed a harmful act to them, say apologizing or trying to make amends in some way. It talks about the potential for restorative practices to facilitate dialogue and build relationships. So they're talking more about kind of community or neighborhood level, for example. If there are a number of asylum seekers who are living in the same place and they wanted to have some kind of dialogue with either the local authority making decisions or a particular housing provider, and equally with the local community, we can do work where we are bringing people together to have dialogue. There doesn't even need to necessarily be any harm. It's about recognizing that everything about our well-being is to do with our relationships. And that's necessarily firm relationships. That's all of our interactions with one another, and prioritizing those things in whatever you're doing, whether you're delivering a service, whether you're in a family, whether you're living in a community, whatever it is, whether you're building a link with your neighbor, whatever it might be, it's the relationship, that the quality of that relationship is inextricably linked to our well-being. So being restorative and taking a restorative approach is about prioritizing relationships. So they could see here, some of the things that practitioners talked about, for example, might be the role of actually what might be considered really community mediation, to try and involve people in talking about the conflict and issues that are going on in their communities, or using restorative practices to try and help people build connections that can support those connectedness, those relationships, greater mutual understanding to support people. Okay, so I'm just going to the end of my talk here. So I'm just going to end with a few kind of conclusions and reflections. So it seems to me that there is real potential for restorative practices and restorative justice with people in the asylum process in relation to the asylum system itself. So we have examples of like refugee-led justice responses, restorative practices in the asylum system, and that there's scope for restorative justice services. And one of the best ways, it seems, for these to be advanced is to work collaboratively with refugee communities to try and understand what people's needs actually are and how they might address the kind of potential barriers to access. Because, on the one hand, it seems surprising that these major providers aren't engaging with asylum seekers and refugees, but we can understand what some of those barriers and challenges might be. So actually engaging with those communities is probably one of the best ways of trying to develop services in a way that meets their needs. But there's a range of challenges here, and one of the biggest ones is that political and policy context. So the dehumanizing rhetoric around asylum seekers and refugees that can be coming from the very top is a major challenge. Punitive, traumatizing practices within the asylum system itself, and the difficulty in engaging formal institutions in restorative practices, I think, are major challenges which would need to be considered here. One of the things I want to end with is this idea of restorative integration. And here Johannes has talked about this, as saying it's about imagining a restorative form of integration that begins with restoring the rights and dignity of the subjects in question. So you start to think about like the integration of asylum seekers and refugees from a restorative perspective, and these ideas of dignity are at the heart. And Alison Phipps and colleagues have described restorative integration as based on practices of intercultural dialogue, multilingualism, conflict transformation, peace building, and community learning and development. So if you actually start to connect ideas of restorative justice and restorative practices with thinking about refugee and asylum integration more broadly, then you start to see how really integration ought to be a process of recovery and creating belonging. And so restorative practices and restorative justice have a clear role here in terms of actually understanding, well, what that process ought to look like, and how can we change the current policies and practices in a way that actually supports recovery and increases justice rather than compounding it. Okay, that's it from me. So thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Steve. That was brilliant. And I think the time now, as you've said, to invite questions. If friends have got questions, could I invite you to stick your hand up or put it in the chat? And we've got the first question. It's applause from Ben Almaty, not a question. Questions from anyone? I suppose one from me to start us off, perhaps. So is just asking if you might just develop a bit the point you made about restorative justice services doing more to overcome barriers to access. You know, what do you think some of those barriers to access, the critical ones are, and what some of the ways forward might be in that area?
Sure. So some of the barriers, so I kind of touched on this, was around like language and communication. So some of the challenges can be, you know, whether people are actually you know, aware of what restorative justice is, and are able to, you know, read and understand some of the communications they might have around restorative justice services. I think a major challenge that I touched on is around trust and mistrust. So so asylum seekers, for example, are less likely to report crime to the police, and part of that, you know, as I touched on, can be a range of factors, including how they were treated by the police or other state institutions in the country of origin, how they might have been treated in the United Kingdom, and also concern about their immigration status and whether actually, you know, engaging, like say the police, could be create problems for them. And because that many restorative justice services are connected to the police in some way, such as that's where their referrals come from, then if people are unwilling to report crime to the police, then that immediately creates a major barrier for them to be able to access restorative justice services. So I guess one of the things, you know, where I kind of got to at the end there is that to engage with people of a refugee background, then one of the things restorative justice services ought to do is to engage directly with people from those communities and organizations from those communities to understand what their needs are and how services, you know, ought to be provided. Some of this might actually be doing things that are not in relation to formally reported crime. Because if people are unwilling or, you know, unable in some way to do it in that way, then I think that's part of it. So some of the other things we talked about was about, you know, do restorative justice services have people who speak the language, or do they have practitioners who reflect the diversity of the communities which they serve?
Yeah.
And some of the organizations I spoke to said that that was definitely something that they were you know, working on doing, and some of them felt like they had actually got a reasonable handle on that. But I think it's a particular challenge in relation to asylum seekers and refugees, because they can come from so many different backgrounds, and also don't necessarily have any choice as to where they end up in the country. So you can end up with people from quite a wide range of different backgrounds, speaking different languages, for example. And so for a service to be able to engage, I think that can be quite challenging.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Marion?
Yeah, hello. Well, I sort of a bit, I don't know if I'm a bit unusual, probably not actually, but I do voluntary work for a refugee organisation at their drop-in. I sort of help with their art table. I'm also part of Resolve West, which is restorative justice services. And also Resolve West has two branches. They also have a community mediation branch, which is unfortunately a bit totally separate, because some I think the PCC or some people in authority see them as totally different, whereas they're not really. But I was trying to think as to whether, I mean, I guess our restorative justice service would handle any cases that came their way in just the normal way, but of course they probably don't have the links with refugee organisations, and that can be quite hard to engage with, because in Bristol, at any rate, there are something like 16 or 18 different refugee organisations, and I don't think the Restorative Justice Service has got the muscle to develop relationships with all of those, which is what they would need to do in order to get referrals, say. I don't think the problem of language, they're used to handling languages, have access to interpretation services. But I've got another question about, on the whole, the refugee services are on the side of the refugees and against the Home Office, and the Home Office procedures are very punitive. I mean, I think that's probably intentionally so, but I just wondered if you thought there was any mileage in getting them to see that there could be fairer ways of doing things, more restorative, in terms of achieving their own aims, which is to decide on whether people's claims to come and stay, whether they're valid or not. It seems to me that a lot of the kind of punitive things are totally unnecessary, and are just being vindictive. Whether you thought there was any sort of any mileage in getting any kind of restorative practice there, and also whether it's the same in other countries, whether they're equally punitive, or whether that's just a British speciality.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's something that I've put a lot of thought into, and it's difficult to say, because when you look at the way the asylum process is designed, when you look at the current political rhetoric on it, it's so hostile that actually it's hard to see how you could make inroads there. I mean, in theory, actually, if you were to use restorative practices to engage with, let's say, the Home Secretary, then maybe that would be interesting to see where that could go. But indeed, with staff who are working in these processes as well, and I think one of the interesting things coming from the Belgium case is they said it's actually staff who are having to actually implement these policies and practices. They can feel that as well as being quite negative, and it creates stress for them, and so they can actually experience the benefits of restorative practices in the work that they do. So it may be if there were ways to kind of bring that in, even if it was around the edges, then this might start to change the way that people thought about this. But really, you're talking about the way that these policies and practices are designed right at their heart. As you say, it's hard to get away from the idea that they aren't actually meant to be vindictive. In the UK, we still talk a bit about the hostile environment. Part of the intention of that is to dissuade people from coming to the UK to apply for asylum in the first place. That's why they make things difficult. It's what the whole Rwanda plan is based on. So it's hard to kind of square that circle, unless there was a change of government, which may potentially have a different approach to this. I don't know. Asylum processes do vary a lot around different countries, but you can see that in a number of other European countries, for example, the experience within the asylum system can still be quite negative. But it does vary, and you can create much more humanizing spaces and responses. And indeed, those do occur, and they can occur really at the neighborhood level as well, where you can have actually very welcoming neighborhoods and so on. So I think that's one of the important things to recognize, is that actually, within it, it's actually quite complex. And you can have, on the one hand, very, welcoming and supportive kind of processes and practices and experience, and you can also have extremely, negative and hostile ones as well, pushing in different directions. But I think that means that it's possible to kind of look at those kind of, gaps and try and build on them, the kind of the positive aspects of people's experience.
I mean, did you see the film called The Old Oak?
Oh, I haven't seen it yet.
No, well, that really describes in film terms how a community kind of changed its mind and was kind of brought to be in sympathy with refugees rather than against them.
Right.
So that kind of illustrates some of your points, quite nicely, really.
One small thought that occurs to me is whether or not the all-party parliamentary group on restorative justice might be gently encouraged to host a listening circle around issues of restorative justice and migration. Because, I mean, the truth is the system is not working for anybody, is it? Perhaps there might be scope to create a safe space to acknowledge that. And anyway,
and I mean, certainly,
any other questions?
Yeah.
Not so much a, can you hear me? Yeah, not so much a question as a comment, really. I work for a refugee organisation in Oxford as a counsellor / therapist. And when I came to this talk, it's interesting because I had a very limited view of what restorative justice meant. And my view harked back to days when I worked in prisons. And it was about an individual meeting the persecutor in any particular situation, and kind of some kind of reparation as a result of that meeting that was held to be beneficial. And I thought, well, how on earth is this going to work when you're talking about individuals who fled really persecutory countries and systems, and come to the Home Office in this country, and how are you going to actually get people to talk? So I thank you, because you've shifted my perspective. And you've made me realise that our organisation, which is called Refugee Resource, is actually completely and utterly geared up towards restorative practices. I have a huge takeaway for which I'm really grateful, which is the importance of working increasingly bottom up, rather than and actually talking more than we already do with refugees and asylum seekers, and getting their perspective on what they actually want and need. So thanks.
Well, thanks very much, and it's great to hear you took something from it. I mean, one thing I could say is there's quite a lively and ongoing debate as to precisely what defines restorative justice, and I'm sure many people here have got their views on it as well. So sometimes it is defined in a very kind of like more limited way, let's say, around precisely what you talked about facilitating dialogue between someone who's committed harm and someone who's been directly harmed by it. Sometimes it's talked about more broadly, and you'll see in the talk I quite often use the term restorative practices, which are actually kind of like a broader set of skills, approaches, and values, which I think are really about supporting constructive communication and positive relationships with each other. So you can have that whole spectrum. When I was talking about the services in England, they were really providing restorative justice in that way that you talked about, which was facilitating it in relation to specific crimes. And so you could support that. But I think, and I've kind of framed this at the starting point, when you think about, well, who's actually creating the harm? Where does it come from? And actually, like, if you take the example in Scotland, in terms of the Parkin tragedy, part of the answer is, well, actually, it's the state. The state actually creates the harm. And therefore, it's actually, when you're talking about trying to facilitate a process, you actually need to bring in the state to take responsibility for the harms that it generates, to try and support people, you know, to try and find a way to recover from that harm and receive some sort of response and perhaps reparation to help them in a road to recovery. And also, it ought to be preventative in terms of trying to avoid further harms in the future.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Susanna, it'd be good to have a follow-up conversation at some point about different models and opportunities for restorative practice in the refugee context in Oxford. But there's another question here from Patience, just finding it in my chat, which is, would the RGA service want to be paid for working with asylum seekers? And if so, who would pay them? Well, there's a vexed question. What do you reckon, Steve?
So, I mean, it depends how they're set up. I mean, if we're talking about those services, let's say in England, that's providing restorative justice to people harmed by crime, then they ought to be, you know, they would be contracted to provide such services to people harmed by crime. So I expect that would just fall within their remit. And part of the issue here may be that people are experiencing barriers to accessing that service. So in a sense, they're potentially already paid to really cover that constituency. It's just that constituency is not really, you know, able to engage with them, or they're, you know, not able to reach out and get in touch with them. But I mean, and I guess one of the other bits here is that, I mean, in a sense, you know, resources always have to be provided to help people. But I think if you think in a more general way about restorative practices, which and one level is about having humanizing relationships with each other, at that level it costs us nothing to engage with each other in a more humanizing way that supports mutual understanding and so on. So there are things that can be done certainly at a neighborhood level that don't require, you know, adding anything different. It's just about relating to each other differently. So there's maybe different ways of thinking about it.
Thanks very much. That's helpful. I know we're approaching the end of our time together. Any further contributions or reflections or questions? John.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on this this question of how you get change from the top down, or how you convince people in the Home Office, etc., that this is important. It's one that we face across the board, isn't it, with restorative practice? It's not just asylum seekers. It's whether it be with homeless services, the prison services, and it always just seems to be that we have to try and find people who are more willing to listen further down the chain, doesn't it? And then try and get pilot projects going that can show positive results as you have done. But the problem, of course, politically, is that it's not about what is right, is it? It's more about what's politically expedient, and that's what comes down from the Home Office, isn't it? So, yeah, where do we find the kind of people in the asylum processes that can bring about the change in the kind of lower to middle levels? And that's one of the questions that I'd have.
I wish I knew the answer to that.
Yeah.
But I guess, you know, you're right in a way that you know, working with people on the ground is probably one of the best ways. And also from that potential, once you start to get people buy-in, then some other people who might be more senior, but perhaps might be more skeptical, often if you can get them in the room, you see that their minds change, because actually it's the kind of witnessing and experiencing of restorative justice and restorative practices which is the most compelling. So, you know, I think in a way it's that kind of work from bottom up is probably the most effective. But, you know, on the other side, it's like, I agree with you, it's very difficult when you have this kind of, you know, the political direction that people are taking. So it does rely, I guess, on some people taking a different perspective on the potential politics of it all in order for it to change.
I think one big takeaway from this for me is around the importance of doing more around that local relationship building with partner organisations. There is a note in the chat from Rachel Richardson saying, not a question, just a quick note to say thank you, and that I so appreciate this important conversation, your knowledge and willingness to share on this topic. While I do not work directly with asylum seekers and refugees, there are some very important parallels. Canadian Armed Forces and National Defence, and I'm responsible for building an RJ program to respond to how within the institution. So appreciate the top-down buy-in piece. It's a challenge we work on every day, despite being given the mandate, understanding of the principles, and the work can be a struggle. There are so many parallels and concepts that I'm taking back to our team this morning with great appreciation. I'll also bring that back to our provincial RJ program, where I also volunteer, as I believe there is a great opportunity to support our refugee communities better. And final one from Mina. Thanks, Steve, for this nice presentation. Many refugees and asylum seekers feel trapped and stuck stuck in their status and unable to progress ahead. But are there, or how can we develop strategies and initiatives to help them, to support them, to learn about their new environment, new skills, and contribute with their skills? That's a big question, isn't it? We've run out of time to answer unless you've got a final reflection.
Probably no great response on that one, but just to say that, you know, I know that there are a lot of you know, great organizations out there, and I think one of the things that's interesting, one of the speakers, you know, mentioned that today, is that actually when you looked at how some of the organizations operate, you can actually see kinds of restorative practices and approaches and how they go about it, because it's about building relationships and showing empathy, for example, and developing those connections and humanizing each other and treating each other with dignity and respect. And so actually, you know, you can see that actually those types of approaches within support services is probably a good way to help people.
Thank you. We're sadly out of time, but very many thanks, Steve. I'm sure we all agree it has been a really informative and thought-provoking sharing of your findings. So that's been brilliant. Thank you. A final note to just say that Hannah's put our evaluation feedback survey in the chat, and we'd really appreciate feedback from as many participants as possible to get your sense of what you find useful and how we can keep on improving things. But in the meantime, yeah, heartfelt thanks and appreciation, Steve. That's been brilliant.
Not a problem. Thanks so much. And if anyone wants to get in touch, just feel free to drop me an email. You can find my details on the University of Edinburgh website.
Brilliant. We'll send round the if it's okay with everyone, the link to your slides and your contact details.
Yep.
Thanks so much.